Welcome to Tramlines, a podcast from Agrii. I'm your host, Tony Smith, putting your questions to the experts. Today we're talking with wildlife expert Marek Nowakowski, Agrii's Don Pendegrast, Technical Manager, Non-Combinable Trials, and John Miles, Seed Technical Manager. IPM has been discussed and talked about for many years, and in some vegetable and horticultural crops is seen as a critical must. In combinable crops, the environmental pressure on the use of and the availability of pesticides to control insect pests, not forgetting the cost of inputs, prompts a new, fresh discussion. And SFI has brought a focus on re-establishing wildlife habitats. Today, we are going to explore the value of integrated pest management in combinable crops. What can we learn about practices that are going on in other crops, as well as using techniques that we already have at our disposal? This episode qualifies for basis and Noroso points. And so, Marek, perhaps you could paint a picture to start us off as to helping us to understand what's in our combinable crops in terms of beneficial insects and insect pests.
Yes, Tony, I did a bit of homework before the meeting and I found a figure that said since 1970, 30% decline in cereal invertebrates, and higher than that was an 80% decline in ground beetles. Having been involved in a lot of research with people like the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, we've lost the habitats that these insects need. Some of them are big travellers, some of them aren't so big travellers, so we need to spread the appropriate habitats round the farm so that they're equidistant. They're not all jammed up in one corner of the farm. But more importantly than that, we've got a handle on pest thresholds. But the research is still ongoing that gives the farmer any indication on what beneficial thresholds should be. I think the big problem we've got is that the baddies build up very quickly, the goodies have to find them and therefore build up more slowly. Insecticides are under pressure, but they've always been relatively cheap. Farmers and agronomists are risk averse. So the temptation is to put an insecticide in just in case. And in defence, having been an agronomist, in the absence of what information is available on beneficial numbers, there isn't really an option for farmer and agronomist. The fastest way to fall out with a farmer is get him to the point nearly at harvest, and then the pest turns up and noshes his way through the crop and the profits. There are apps from CEH. They're looking at pitfall traps. They're looking at a whole variety of things that will be aids to identification. But at the end of the day, I still feel IPM is a nice talk. It's a nice tick box. Farmers are getting paid for it. But as you said in the introduction, I'm still not absolutely sure we know what it means.
Very interesting indeed, Marek. Don, I know you spend a lot of time looking at non-combinable crops. Remind us of some of the reasons why we need to control pests and what you see as that potential loss in crop value.
Yeah, I mean, it's extremely important, Tony, both in terms of impact on yield, but also in terms of the quality outcomes you've got from those crops. So, I mean, probably a lot of the thought process I'll talk about today will be probably thinking from things like field vegetables, which is sort of the most obvious kind of horticulturally related to kind of broader cropping, and it is absolutely critical. And pest pressure can last pretty much the whole season through in terms of kind of managing that crop right through to harvest, and making sure as well that you haven't got any contamination of pests or possibly beneficials when you actually harvest the crop as well.
And if we then look at combinable crops such as cereals, etc., John, let's bring you in here. What are the key pests and what are the key issues for farmers there?
I think, as Marek rightly said, they build very quickly, and the weather is the major driver to whether they actually appear or not. But obviously, aphids across cereals and brassicas is a big element. And in the summertime as well, things like orange wick blossom midge. We had some bad years. Maybe we've eroded the numbers in the soils, and we don't see it quite so much these days. Yeah, cabbage stem flea beetle would be another example of the sort of boom and bust cycle that we see within pest populations. So they're quite hard to predict. Of course, that's supplying a food source to the beneficials as well. So it's not easy to map and think about your risk for those insects, and hence consequently why insecticides, bang for buck and reactivity have been as popular as they have been for those uses.
And Don, for those non-combinable crops that you focus on, integrated pest management, IPM, has been a key tool for a long time, hasn't it?
Yeah, it has. I mean, you look at some of the technologies that are used and the approaches, and they are decades old. In some cases, so you think back to some of the sort of fungal pathogens that might be used to control certain pests, and those products have been in the marketplace for sort of the best part of 30 years. So this concept is not new. It's obviously become more acute as we've lost more plant protection technology, and also as maybe there's been more of awareness around the risk of things, or the perceived risk around things like residues.
And John, for those combinable crops, are we thinking about integrated pest management enough?
I think everybody's been practicing the level of IPM for a long time. It's just whether it's sort of fully fulfilled. As Marek suggested, there are thresholds for some pest species and diseases, and action, or the course of action, is taken by what is right for that level of trouble, and also finances, and what's best for best for the environment. Certainly in the last few years, blossom midge, as we mentioned, has become less of an issue. But in the last 10 years, talking to people, it's not so much around the safety of the crop that they're most concerned. They know that actually end of May, beginning of June is when insects will be really starting to become much more active and in huge number, and prophylactically or broad spectrum insecticides at that time of year are going to have negative benefits. So I think people are more aware of the sort of wider thought processes around the way that plays out within the environment.
Marek, can you talk us through what are some of the beneficial insects that we're looking for in combinable crops that could be really helpful?
Beetles, bugs, centipedes, flies, lacewings, spiders, mites, sawflies. I mean, there are hundreds of them. But the bit that makes the difference, and I can say, and I'm proud to say, that I've spent 8 years developing a link between the beneficial we want and the habitat it needs. What we're lacking in SFI is targeted habitats with any degree of longevity. It takes a long time to build up the right habitat for the beneficial insects. We need them in the right places. I mean, many of the carabid beetles don't move much more than sort of 50, 60 meters. CEH did some work in the Assist project where they looked at in-field wildlife strips. That's yet to be written up, but there is an indication that there is a yield benefit. But the million-dollar question of farmer is, I'm going to invest in this in-field strip, so I'm losing yield and I'm spending money on the mix. Now I have to crunch the numbers and see whether it's worthwhile. And I don't want to preempt the results, but I think that the environment is going to have to work extremely hard to produce a level of beneficial insects that the farmer buys into. That it's always been a problem where certain insects, say for example the ladybird, it has two very different life cycles. One is based on pollen and nectar, and the other one is based on eating live food. So these simple mixtures really don't fill. If you're only filling half a life cycle, the life cycle collapses. It's something that Agrii are increasingly focusing on, and it's something I would support and push wholeheartedly.
And Marek, you talk about the level of understanding in the horticultural crops. So could you share with us, what works well in those crops?
It's I think it's very much, there is a danger of overcomplicating it, putting the right habitats in the right place, near enough to make. There was many years ago, God, 30 years ago, I was involved in a project called the 3D project, where they sowed a variety of habitats next to the crops to try and put the beneficials this year where we needed them to attack the crop pests for next year. Sadly, that didn't work for a variety of reasons, but the complexity fascinates me. For example, you've got things like ladybirds that will start noshing their way through aphids on a cereal crop leaf. Once the aphids feel under threat, they drop to the ground as an escape mechanism. That is brilliant. And what then happens is they get swept up by the carabids. So when you start putting this whole beneficial insect thing under the microscope and learning a little bit more about it, I think we've got a long way to go. I think we can take farmers with us.
And John, what would you like to add?
I think, yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with Marek there. The challenge from a practical point of view, looking after crops, is having the confidence that the beneficials are going to be there. We have many conversations around, great, there's a load of ladybirds in the beans, right? When are they going to come into the cereal crop? There's just not that. And because, we look at pests, we've got thresholds to pests, and I know Marek's very passionate about this. We have no real way of monitoring unless you do pitfall traps and things that, to sort of get these critical numbers of influx of beneficials into crops. And this is where perhaps some of the new technology, there's various remote sensing devices that perhaps we could start to see a migration coming from the field boundaries and the habitats that we provide. And we can start, they're on the move. We have these things like the suction traps for aphids. So we know when certain types of aphids are on the wing. Great. We need that same sort of understanding and information for beneficials to start to build confidence that yes, the army will come.
But isn't this, John, where we pick up from CEH? They've got pitfall traps. They've got a whole variety of things. And what farmers at the moment, I'm not familiar with all the aspects of SFI, but do you adopt an SFI policy, Mr. Farmer? If the answer is yes, you tick the box and you get a sum of money. What nobody is saying is, can you describe, Mr. Farmer, what you do? Now, if we could build up as agronomists, or if Agrii could build up a relationship between farmers going into pitfall traps and how to identify, well, they don't identify, the app identifies the beetles. We can then see a very strong correlation between the rise of beneficials and their names and numbers through the pitfall traps and a decline in pest attack. Now that to me is a huge step forward. We've got the tools, but it's a case of going to busy people and saying, look, you're going to have to find a bit of extra time somewhere. CEH have got 60 of these farmers involved in this, and they're building a picture. But the bigger and the stronger that picture is, the more information we come through. But just to say, I believe in IPM. For example, the carabids need tussocky grass. Many of the other insects need pollen and nectar, so that's flowers. Unless we can build those two habitats together, life cycles aren't completed. It's very doable.
And Don, in those horticultural crops, is it much easier to assess the insect populations of both pest and also predator?
I think there's certainly a very high intensity of physical monitoring going on alongside monitoring networks. But I do think the point that both Marek and John have made about, I think the beneficial monitoring in the predominance is more based on visual look-see in the crop. The actual sort of technologies we're using for monitoring are very much still pest focused, and I do think that's something we've got to continue to progress with, to understand that balance between the pest thresholds and the state that the beneficials are in. And then I think critically, then in a horticultural scenario, we'll look, certainly internally, we'll look to communicate across agronomists in terms of what we're seeing, in terms of what's being seen in terms of the beneficial populations, across different localities, so people can begin to build up a knowledge an understanding as to whether pests are present or around, and then that might decide what you're going to do, and you might look to use something that's more kind of biological or physical type chemistries that are not going to have the same impact on the beneficials.
Why not listen to other episodes here on Tramlines, such as The Bees and the Birds and Helping Wildlife to Bridge the Hungry Gap on Farm?
Can I ask Don a very quick question? It seems to me that the horticultural crops are very high value, so you're getting people walking over them more regularly. The level of knowledge is very high. Does that mean that there is the money to develop a higher level of knowledge and science? Whilst in many of the combinable crops, and this is perhaps a dangerous overstatement, it's just too easy to say, well, I'll stick in £1.50's worth of an insecticide as an insurance. But certainly talking to the veg boys that I do on occasions, and from what Don has said, these are much higher value crops. So therefore, Don, can they afford a higher level of management, a higher level of investment, a higher level of input?
I think the reality is that they certainly warrant it. Yes. So I think you're quite right in saying they're going to be walked more. They tend to represent sort of slightly physically smaller areas. They tend to get a lot more observation. And because they are higher value, I mean, there's a big range there, depending on which veg crop you're talking about. But I think overall, as a principle, there's much more of a bespoke, focused, local, more possibly, I'll use the word forensic observation of what is going on in the crop and gaining of understanding. And I think that does lead to this benefit. And again, sharing information between other local probably helps as well that there's less people working in that sector. So it's easier in some ways to transfer information between a smaller number of individuals.
This is a fascinating conversation to listen into. John, I can see you've got a question for either Don or Marek.
I've got a question for Marek. Just thinking about, sort of soil health has become a new topic of conversation, and in the psyche, and people talk about, we've got a farm, we've got to care for, we've got to look after the microbes in the soil. We almost probably need the same philosophy around providing the habitat for beneficials, but then the key thing is you've got to keep feeding them. You can't feed them and then not feed them. Marek, I mean, what sort of thoughts on, providing a habitat, we're going to, if you suddenly have to use insecticides, and you've just taken away all of the food source potentially as well, haven't you? You've got to have some level of consistency of food for beneficials to see the season through.
Is this where I bring the word refuges in? If every farmer set 8 to 10%, when we've done the science, if every farmer set 8 to 10% of his farm aside in semi-permanent habitats, yes, you can spray. When we did the Hillsdon project in the early 2000s, 2,500 acres, we compared business as usual versus the old entry level versus our version of sort of all the bells and whistles. Farm profit went up, and what we created, and I wouldn't say it was the be all and end all, but we recorded, because the ologists did, a massive increase in insects across the board, some of which were an increase in crop pests, we've got to be honest, but the majority were an increase in beneficial insects. And beneficial insects, if they're going to be active from March till September, which is most cropping time, you've got to have the habitats they need from March to September. And the classic case is the wildflower mixtures. They do a hell of a lot in June and July, but that's about all they do. Well, if you've come out in March, it's a hell of a long wait till July. Certainly the pollen and nectar seekers can't cope without food for very long. Carabids and things that would live in the tussocky and taller grasses at the base of hedges, they don't need to be fed every 5 minutes. They're quite cheap to run. But this habitat placement, this habitat continuity is really something that I think it's sadly been left out of conservation agriculture and regenerative farming. They've just sort of, they haven't even touched on that yet. And it's something I feel, if agriculture can see this aspect as a new opportunity and something we're going to have to grasp with both hands, because the decline in pesticide availability and use is going to make our lives far more dependent on, if you like, environmental management options.
Don, from your point of view, what's being used in the horticultural sector? What could we be starting to consider more of in the combinable cropping sector in terms of what we can apply to crops?
Okay, so we do still have a limited number of insecticides left. The critical thing with those, of course, is it's making sure. One of the key things would be done in horticulture is understanding what the beneficial profile of those individual insecticides is and the impact they will have on given beneficials. So that's kind of an important consideration. We're starting to use or see more use of physical slash biological insecticides. They tend not to be as efficacious as conventional chemistry, but they do have they can work quite well, particularly early on, in terms of knocking back pest populations, as I said earlier, with a particular benefit to sort of allowing the beneficial populations to build up. Or they can be used in some crops, not so much field veg, but a little bit more in fruit crops, maybe as a way of sort of cleaning the crop up towards the end. And I do think there will be more need to consider using those down the line. There are pathogenic insecticides out there. That conception has been around for quite some period of time, with limited usage. I do think, though, there'll be more of a focus, and there is a growing focus on how you can use those sort of microorganisms that might infect certain pests and are quite selective. I think that will become more of a focus over time. I think the monitoring is a critical consideration as well. I think maybe elements of trap cropping are sort of an important consideration, and we are seeing more thought going into the use of trap cropping in horticultural settings. And probably the other one, which I think is a little bit more blue sky at the moment, is trying to use a bit of push pull, but also maybe trying to use elicitation. We tend to think about that just in its fungicidal, using the genetics of the plant, but I know there is some evidence out there, and we've been doing a little bit of work looking at using elicitors that are more focused on the impacts on insects, and so they can have an impact in terms of reducing the period of pest settlement on the leaf, but can also increase the attraction into the crop of beneficial insects. Again, at the moment, a lot of that's kind of lab-based with a limited amount of work in the field, but that could be something that I think could have more potential benefit, particularly thinking about arable settings more in the medium to long term.
And Don, could you share a little bit about the use of adjuvants as stickers or spreaders?
Okay, so there's a couple of different scenarios. So if we think in potatoes, they're getting used quite a lot as a way of coating the crop leaf to reduce the sort of risk of aphid settlement on the leaf, and therefore the reduction in transfer of viruses. So you're basically using them as a coater to coater. They can have some suffocation benefit as well in terms of pests like aphids, but they predominantly make it harder for the insect to settle and harder for the insect to actually sort of go onto the crop in the first place. They tend to result in the insect either falling off or going off to another sort of easier to land site. And we are seeing sort of vegetable oil type products being used as suffocants. Again, as I said before, often easier as a mop-up, particularly in fruit crops, but more commonly in veg crops. They're used earlier on. They are not. They can work quite well, but they are the critical element is they're not systemic. They have to coat the pest, so they're often easier applied on smaller crops, particularly with vegetables, and they have to coat the pest. So they are limited at the moment in terms of actually what you can do with them. The other angle on that is silicone products, which can work as almost like a sticker. It's almost like you coat the leaf and the insect basically begins to be unable to move. We've got some early indication that those kind of products could work quite well with fungal pathogens for pests. But at the moment, that's kind of early days. Got some good potential work on that in Lepidoptera this year, but we need to spend more time looking at that. Does that give you a feel?
Yes, thanks ever so much, Don. Very, very comprehensive and really interesting too. John, if I could just ask you about varietal tolerances to insect pests. For combinable crops, that's well understood, isn't it?
Yeah. I think we've people are still looking at all the tools that Don was talking about within the broadacre cereal sphere. It's there's the expense, and as Don said, you've got to cover things quite regularly to try and hit the pest or cover every leaf. So the use is not straightforward. A genetic tool is very straightforward, and we've had turnip yellow resistance within brassicas. We've had orange weak blossomage around for many years, so people know it's sort of it's a from when you plant it to when you harvest it solution, which is really neat. I guess the new introduction in recent years has been after 20 plus years of work from RAGT behind the scenes to bring in BYDV resistance genetics that were of use in Australia. Spent many years bringing them from an Australian background to a more English type. And there are now varieties on the market and bread making varieties on the market which do offer BYDV resistance. So it really is a safety net for yield production. That regardless of how much BYDV there is, the yield will be unaffected. So, and with SFI and as everything is, that sort of general direction of travel, there are solutions there for farmers in a neat, tidy package, which is the plant genetics.
And as we come to the end of this podcast, what thought would you like to leave with listeners when it comes to heightening our integrated pest management in combinable crops?
You want 4 to 5 habitats per 100 hectares. Every time it's quality, not quantity. Habitat variety is absolutely key. And the one thing that we often overlook is how we fill that hungry gap. And on many occasions, hedges play that March-April role, and we haven't even imposed ourselves on the farmer's cropped area.
And Don, what are your closing thoughts?
We understand the pest and the beneficial insects and how to encourage them. I think it's understanding how to minimize the impact. If we have to bring in control options, it's trying to look for the most the safest options we can use to minimize the impact on the beneficials.
And John, to close this podcast, what are your thoughts?
Listening to the conversation, Tony, that I think we exercise IPM within an industry. We've certainly got leading agricultural practices globally. We've already made some really big steps, but it really feels that there's another level that could be achieved to get that belief of creating the habitat, and then the beneficial insects will fill it is a big step. But it does feel like that is the top step of IPM.
Thank you to you all for such a fascinating conversation. And don't forget, this podcast qualifies for BASES and Noroso points. That's it for this podcast, but do tune in again as we meet the experts throughout the season, exploring the many immediate and longer-term questions for growers and farmers in the UK. If you have any questions that you would like us to ask the experts, email info@agrii.co.uk. See you next time.